If the Crusades in the 10, 11, and 1200s were unable to conquer, European countries later were able to conquer every Muslim country except for perhaps Morocco. All other Muslim countries have been conquered. Egypt was by Britain. Libya was conquered by Italy. Algeria was conquered by France. The Great Sahara Desert was mostly conquered by France. The Sudan was conquered by Britain. Then over here in the Middle East, France and Britain together conquered Iraq. France did a lot of conquering in Persia. The Ottoman Empire was not conquered, but eventually it died. It became the sick man of Europe. The Muslim world fell way, way far behind and kept getting farther and farther behind, and simply were not able to hold their own in the modern world. And we would not hear anything about the Muslim world today except for two things. Number one, a lot of oil was found in this region right here. And the other, Western nations began giving these people armaments, which they wound up turning and using against us. Take that away, and these people would be the nomads of the world, the poor people of the world. If we could go back 120 years or so ago to the 1890s, we'd find these people riding on camels, living like Abraham did, and though not advanced any more than Abraham was technologically. Dirt poor, extremely left out. And it really bothers them that when all the inventions were made by everybody else in the world, they themselves have invented nothing. And they wonder, where did we go wrong? What went wrong? Well, Muhammad taught them to inquire about science. Well, I'll tell you two places they went wrong. Number one, they did not give their people freedom. Only free people can be inventive or creative folk. People living in margins. Number two, they were afraid of science because science seemed to conflict with their theology. And again, that's a problem that I mentioned last time and before. Monotheistic people have had this problem that seemed like science and theology conflicts. But in Europe, yes, science and theology did conflict, but science was able to march on in spite. In the Muslim world and the Chinese world, science was stopped. And in China, it was stopped by their philosophers. In the Muslim world, it was stopped by their clerics. And they were afraid of knowledge, afraid of where it would lead. All right. Your book then goes on, were the Crusades good or bad? What were the effects? Now, these authors have been writing this book, folk, for many, many, many years. And they tend to have a, what you might say, lenient attitude toward the Islamic world. As time goes on, particularly in the light of what's happening very, very recently, since this book was written, it's becoming more and more difficult to justify or defend the actions of some of the Muslim people. Again, one person apologized for the Crusades, apologized to the Muslim world, but someone else said, we need to apologize for that apology. We did not owe these people an apology because the Crusaders knew that if they did not take the fight to these people, take the fight to their territory, these people would come to them and take the fight to them. Which was exactly what would have happened. It was a case of Europe rising up and taking the offensive instead of waiting for their enemies to come to them. I mean, before this time, Europe had been invaded by the Vikings, the Magyars, and the Muslims coming from the south, from the west, and from the east. Instead, Europe rose up and said, we're going to take charge, and Europe began to fight back. Now, one history book I read when I was in graduate school, we were required to do a lot of reading, said if Islam had taken over Europe, would it have been so bad? My professor, even back in 1971, was a pro-Muslim teacher. I may not have to say it. Pro-Muslim. But he had us read a book. If the Muslims had taken over, my take on it is, and it should be obvious to you, if the Muslims had actually taken over Europe, the automobile, the airplane, the radio, the television would never have been invented. Now, most of you would pretty quickly disagree with, oh no, these inventions would happen anyway. No, these inventions only came about as a result of people who were free to think and independently think and say that we disagree with the norm. If the Wright brothers had lived in Morocco, they would never have invented the airplane. If Marconi had lived in Pakistan, he would never have invented the radio. If Samuel Morse had lived in Egypt, he would not have invented the telegraph. If Alexander Graham Bell had lived in Syria, he would not have invented anything. Same for Thomas Edison. If Islam had taken over Europe, I'm convinced we would be still for you to come to school with horses. The schools would be rather tiny, and to put your horse out to pasture, let him graze while you came in and learned. If there'd be even a college like this, which is doubtful. Now, if any of you want to disagree with what I'm saying, you're welcome to. I've had students disagree with that statement. So to some extent, folk, we're here, living in a modern world, in part because of the crusading spirit. Now, one thing that came out of the crusading spirit was the hospital. The group of people called Knights Hospitallers set up hospitals, and then these hospitals reached all over Europe. There were improvements made in medicine as Europeans learned medicine from the Muslims, who at that time were ahead of us. Trade, definitely. These people, cities in Italy benefited from the trade, particularly Venice and Genoa. Your Italian traders, your book mentions. There was a revival of commerce, a revival of trade. Unfortunately, also, one of the bad effects was the European people began to hate Jews even more, and they were to hate Jews even more as a result of what came in the next chapter, namely the Black Death. All right. Before I turn to page the next chapter, there's just one other incident I want to bring up in connection with the Crusades. How many of you have heard of a group called the Knights Templar? Only about 2, 3 of you. Okay. The Templars came to Crusade supposedly. Now, folks, here's the story, briefly. A group of people who were descended from the Merovingian dynasty were guarding what supposedly was Solomon's stables. And these, of course, you all know the Merovingians claimed to be descended from King Solomon anyway. These Merovingians supposedly discovered a paper of Solomon containing a big, important secret. Among other things, the secret of how to accumulate a large amount of wealth. So they went back to Europe, and they set up an organization called the Templars. Actually, they started it here in Jerusalem, and some of them spread back to Europe. And the Templars would collect knights who had been turned out of the church, oftentimes for drinking or adultery, and other reasons. So the church turned out. The Templars said, well, you can rejoin the church, just join our group. The Pope the Pope approved of them, the Pope of that day, and then St. Bernard of Clairvaux, whom I hardly mentioned, but he wrote up a charter for the order, and it became like an order, instead of an order, well, it was an order of monks, but instead of an order of monks that sat and prayed, these were an order of fighting monks, monks who carried a sword, and the Templars would promise these knights, hey, if you can't afford armor, join us, we'll provide you with armor, we'll provide you with swords and helmets and shields and even a horse, we'll help you get started. So the Templars became an order of knights, and their job was to, among other things, drive out the infidel. Well, the Templars went on to set up banking institutions and accumulate great amounts of wealth, but they made one big mistake. They would not engage in charity, and this turned the people of Europe against them. Well, finally, one day, King Philip IV, I called him Philip the Fair, King Philip IV decided that he had enough of them. All right, well, here's the story. Philip IV was facing a riot one day, and he was fearful of his life, so he fled inside a Templar temple. And the Templars protected him until he felt safe to return to his palace. But Philip was very intrigued with this order, but he couldn't join because he was married. But then one day his wife died. So now that his wife had died, he felt like he could join the Templars because he was not living with any woman. So he did something you don't do with these organizations. He applied for membership, where he asked to join, and the Templars blackballed him. He thought, me, the king, and with all my fighting skills, you blackballed me. So he began to spread rumors about him. Now, folk, if you really look at the story in detail, it gets rather raunchy. But he's had 5 knights infiltrated groups that take oaths of secrecy, promise secrecy, and join in and infiltrate, but report back to me everything you see. So these 5 knights took oaths of secrecy and came back and reported that in their secret meetings, these Templars were worshiping Lucifer, worshiping Satan, and engaging in all kinds of sexual orgies among themselves and all kinds of really, really bad stuff. And they planned, they planned to take over Europe and destroy all monarchies and all nobility and set themselves up as an ideal state. Well, King Philip petitioned the Pope. The Pope ordered all the Templars to be rounded up, and the Templars were massacred. This massacre occurred on a Friday the 13th, and if any of you know, you'll hear about this on every time a Friday the 13th occurs if you're listening. The Templars had suffered 2 disasters. When Saladin let the Christians go back here in the Holy Land, he said, all you Christians go, all the Templars line over here. So the Templars are forced to line up in line. Then Saladin told them, go and hack them all to pieces. And the Templars were hacked to pieces. This occurred on a Friday the 13th. The Templars were all massacred in France and in a bunch of Europe and Italy on a Friday the 13th. However, some of the Templars escaped and went to Scotland. And that's why today you have Scottish Rites Hospital. The Templars reformed themselves in Scotland, and they aided the Scottish king in getting victory over Britain and keeping Scotland independent for another 300 years. But supposedly they hid their treasure in the land of America across the sea. And you might have heard, well, I didn't know that America was called America. I didn't either, but nevertheless they claim they hid their treasure somewhere. There's evidence that Templars were in fact in North America. The treasure has never been found. So a lot of their treasure, the gold that they accumulated, money, has disappeared permanently. But now, why is this important? Well, they claimed that they were setting up an ideal state. Oh, by the way, about Scottish, the Templars are so concerned now about charity that they've credited with starting the Scottish Rite Hospital, which aids crippled children in walking. They've been doing this for years. Or that, in other words, they're now a charitable organization, which is something they missed out on. However, they claimed that they were going to set up an ideal kingdom, an ideal organization. And folk, a lot of persons, if you read the right books, will say that they found their home across the sea, and the ideal society that they set up is called the United States of America. Where do we get our idea of the electors electing the president? It comes to the Templar Constitution. The Templars said we only pick the best of people, but then the best of the best form this electors, and the best of the best of the best, they will elect our Grand Vizier, our leader, and it will not be hereditary. Well, the idea the founding fathers had was only the property owners, male property owners, could vote, and these male property owners would elect state legislators, and the state legislators would elect the electors, and then the electors would assemble and choose a president. Now, that's not the way it's actually worked in practice, but that was what they had planned, where only the best of the best of the best would choose the top leader. It comes from the Templar Constitution. You may or may not have heard that every one of our founding fathers were Masons. The Masons, some of them claim to have roots among the Templars. Secret organization that felt like they knew how to keep the money rolling, how to bring prosperity, and how to set up an ideal government. And they found no home in Europe. Europe was too steeped in its old ways. They found a home instead across the sea. All right, anyone want to comment about this? Anyone have any? All All right. I mean, hopefully, I meant to throw some shocking statements out at you. I mean, again, it's conspiracy history, but folks, there's some things about it that touches on real history. Your book does not mention the Templars, but if you take medieval history, spend a year, you will run into them. The history books will devote 3 or 4 paragraphs to them. All right. With that, I'll move on. Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine Empire comes the word Byzantium, which was the place where Constantine has up his capital, an area right here, an area located on a peninsula where the Mediterranean Sea and Black Sea come together. Very strategic trading center. The first king of the Byzantine Empire to amount to anything was Justinian.